On a frigid winter evening, as the wind howled through the dark pine forests of Alaska, Warren Pierce sat in his log cabin, enjoying the cozy warmth of the crackling fireplace. His hands cupped a steaming mug of tea while his thoughts lazily circled the routines of his solitary life. A thick layer of snow had blanketed the world, a silent, merciless shroud of white that seemed to swallow all life. A scratching at the door broke the silence. Warren froze. In this remote wilderness, unexpected visitors were rare. Perhaps a stray dog or a coyote searching for food. But then he heard a faint whimper, followed by a dull thud against the wood. Curiosity mingled with caution as he rose and crept toward the door. Through the frosted window he could make out two shadows, large figures motionless in the snowstorm. Warren grabbed his flashlight, took a deep breath, and slowly opened the door. Before him stood two wolves. Startled, he took a step back, but instead of growling or baring their teeth, the animals stood trembling, their coats matted and covered in snow. Their eyes glowed in the faint light of the flashlight, not with hostility, but with pleading. One of the wolves, a larger animal with a scar on its muzzle, stayed close to its companion, a smaller wolf with a strikingly gray-speckled back that stood on three legs, barely putting weight on the fourth. Warren knew it was madness to let wild animals into his home, but his heart told him these wolves were no threat. They were desperate, pushed to the edge of their endurance. He made a decision that would change his life. Slowly, he stepped aside and let the door open a crack wider. The wolves exchanged a glance, a silent understanding, before cautiously entering. As soon as they crossed the threshold, a shiver seemed to run through their bodies, as if they were feeling real warmth for the first time in days. Warren closed the door behind them and instinctively held his breath. The animals stood still, sniffing the air, their eyes scanning the room. Then the larger wolf moved cautiously forward, while the smaller one clumsily settled onto an old blanket in the corner, not moving. Warren knew that any sudden movement could unsettle the wolves. Instead, he did the only thing he could. He slowly sat down on the floor, maintaining a respectful distance, and observed. His gaze fell on the smaller wolf's injured leg. It was swollen, and in some places, the fur had parted to reveal a blood-crusted wound. Without making any sudden moves, Warren stood up and fetched a small bowl of water. He placed it at a safe distance and retreated. The wolves fixed him with their watchful eyes. Only after several minutes had passed, and no danger seemed to come from him, did the larger wolf slowly lower its muzzle to the bowl. The smaller one followed hesitantly. It was a quiet moment of trust. After a while, Warren decided to take the next step. He rummaged through his supplies and found some dried meat. He placed a few pieces on the floor and stepped back. The smaller wolf was the first to approach, sniffing cautiously before finally taking a piece. The larger one followed, and together they devoured the meal in a few bites. As the wolves ate, Warren felt a growing sense of compassion. These animals had come to his door from the wild, not as hunters but as helpless creatures seeking refuge. Something had driven them here, perhaps hunger, or maybe an even greater enemy. He had to make a decision. Should he offer them shelter just for the night, or was he already caught up in something that went beyond a simple act of compassion? Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside the small cabin, it was warm. For a moment, it seemed as if an invisible boundary between man and beast had dissolved. The first night with the wolves in his cabin was a mix of tension and wonder for Warren. The larger wolf lay in a corner, watchful but calm, while the smaller one, exhausted from pain and cold, curled up on the blanket. The crackling of the fire was the only sound in the silent night. Warren stayed awake for a long time, observing his unexpected guests and wondering about their story. Had they been separated from their pack? Had the cold and hunger become too much to bear? As the storm outside continued to batter the walls of the cabin, Warren decided he would help them, at least as much as he could. In the morning, Warren was awakened by the soft shuffling of the wolves. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting the land in a frosty blue light. The larger wolf had risen and was moving slowly around the cabin, while the smaller one struggled to stand, hesitantly putting weight on its injured leg. Warren decided to go outside to gather more firewood and assess the situation. Before opening the door, he hesitated for a moment and glanced at the wolves. "Stay here, I'll be back soon," he murmured, even though he knew they couldn't understand him. Outside, the biting cold hit him. The storm from the night had left deep snowdrifts, but the sky was now clear. Warren trudged through the snow, collecting wood and checking the tracks around the area. There were no fresh tracks except those of the wolves, no signs of a pack nearby. When he returned, he found the wolves almost unchanged. They hadn't touched his supplies and watched him with wary eyes, a sign that they at least respected him to some degree. Warren knew he had to tend to the smaller wolf's injured leg. He fetched his first aid kit, knelt slowly beside the animal, and spoke in soothing tones. The wolf flinched as Warren touched the wound, letting out a low growl, but it remained lying down. Patiently, Warren cleaned the wound, applied antiseptic ointment, and bandaged the leg as best he could. The larger wolf watched every move intently but didn't intervene. Perhaps it understood that Warren was trying to help. After the treatment, Warren sank heavily into a chair. He knew these two animals couldn't stay forever, but as long as they were here, it was his responsibility to care for them. As the day passed, Warren began to grow accustomed to their presence. He cooked simple meals for himself and left meat scraps for the wolves, which they gratefully accepted. Occasionally, the larger wolf would lift its head, as if listening for something in the distance. Was it searching for its pack, or fearing that something, or someone, might be following them? The sun soon dipped toward the horizon, and dusk brought an uneasy feeling. Were they truly alone out here? Warren stepped to the window and let his gaze sweep over the snow-covered landscape. Then he noticed something, a movement at the edge of the forest, a shadow moving almost silently between the trees. A cold shiver ran down Warren's spine. They weren't alone. He grabbed the binoculars from the table and focused on the movement in the distance. The outline was unclear, but he could tell it was an animal, a wolf or something else. The cold seeped into his fingers as he gripped the binoculars tighter, his breathing shallow. The larger wolf in the cabin suddenly lifted its head, ears pricked. A low growl escaped its throat as it stared toward the dark forest edge. The smaller wolf, despite its pain, also seemed to sense the threat and slowly raised its head. Warren knew he had to act. He stepped back, set the binoculars aside, and reached for his rifle leaning against the wall. He hoped he wouldn't have to use it, but in this wilderness, he couldn't afford to be unprepared. Slowly, he opened the door a crack and stepped outside. The snow crunched under his boots as he moved closer to the porch. The wolves inside watched his every move, as if understanding that something dangerous was approaching. The shadow moved again, this time closer. Warren held his breath. Then he heard a deep growl from the darkness. Another pair of glowing eyes emerged from the shadows. Another wolf. Warren stood in the cold night air, his breath forming small clouds in the moonlight. The second wolf at the forest's edge was larger than the others, its coat thicker and darker, an alpha, or perhaps another lost member of a pack. Warren couldn't tell, but the tension in his body didn't ease. The larger wolf in the cabin reacted immediately. It sprang to its feet, fur bristling, its stance wavering between fear and readiness to defend. The growl that came from its throat was deep and warning. The injured wolf flinched but didn't rise from its blanket. It knew it stood little chance of defending itself in its condition. Warren kept his rifle ready, but didn't want to use it. He didn't want to become the aggressor, especially not against a creature that might simply be searching for companions. Instead, he watched closely, trying to decipher every movement of the new wolf. The newcomer remained at the boundary between the forest and the clearing, its head lowered, ears forward. It moved slowly, almost hesitantly, as if unsure whether it was allowed to approach. Then it lifted its muzzle and let out a long, drawn-out howl that echoed across the snowy landscape. No answer came. Warren glanced briefly at the two wolves in the cabin. The larger wolf had reacted to the howl with ears pricked. It no longer growled, its tension replaced by an almost longing expression. The injured wolf let out a soft whimper. Was this their leader or a sibling? The dynamics between the animals remained a mystery to Warren. He made a decision. Slowly, he lowered the rifle and took a cautious step forward. "I don't know if you're here for them," he murmured into the darkness, "but if you mean no harm, you'll have to show it." The large wolf outside didn't react immediately. Instead of moving closer or attacking, it lowered its head further and finally lay down in the snow, a clear posture of submission. Surprised, Warren turned to the wolves in the cabin. The larger of the two stepped cautiously to the door, sniffed the cold night air, and after a long moment of hesitation, stepped outside. Warren remained tense but didn't reach for the rifle. He could feel that something was happening here, something beyond his control. The wolves would have to decide what came next. The wolf in the snow remained still. Only when the larger wolf approached did it lift its head. The two animals sniffed each other cautiously, circling slowly, testing. Then suddenly, the larger wolf let out a soft yelp. Not aggressive, but acknowledging. The injured wolf inside lifted its head and responded with a weak sound. It was a reunion. Warren exhaled as if he'd been holding his breath. Slowly he stepped back, giving the wolves the space they needed. He didn't yet know what this meant, whether this new wolf was a threat or indeed a lost pack member. But for now it was clear that they knew each other, that they belonged together. The night passed and the three wolves now sat together outside the cabin. The injured wolf had dragged itself to the doorway, watching the other two from a safe distance. Warren let them be. He knew this was a turning point. He retreated inside, added more wood to the fire, and sat at the table, his mind racing. What should he do now? These wolves were strangers, yet he had felt responsible for them since they had knocked on his door. He knew they couldn't stay forever, but was it even his decision to make? Outside, the new wolf finally settled down, and the other two followed its lead. That night, it was no longer just a lone man in a remote cabin. It was an unexpected alliance between man and beast, brought together in the unforgiving wilderness. Warren looked out the window at the resting wolves. "I guess you'll stay a little longer," he murmured, leaning back. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls as outside. Nature sealed its own silent pact. The morning sun bathed the snow-covered forest in a pale light as Warren was awakened by a faint sound. The wolves were stirring. The larger wolf was already up, shaking snow from its fur and gazing toward the tree line. The newly arrived wolf stayed close to its side, while the injured wolf stretched forward. Warren sensed that the moment was approaching. These three wolves weren't meant for a life in a cabin. They belonged out in the wild, back with their pack or wherever their instincts led them. He stepped outside and watched the animals. The wind carried fresh tracks across the snow. Nature wasn't waiting. Warren knew it wasn't his decision whether they stayed or left. Yet he found it hard to accept that he might soon no longer have them by his side. Slowly he approached the injured wolf, who was now standing, albeit cautiously. Warren knelt down and studied the animal. "You'll make it," he said softly, almost whispering. The wolf held his gaze for a moment before turning to its companion. Suddenly, the larger wolf lifted its head and listened. A faint howl echoed in the distance. Warren felt his chest tighten. That was their call. Their family was out there. The two healthy wolves reacted immediately, their bodies tense and alert. The injured wolf hesitated, but its instinct was stronger than its weakness. Warren stepped back and gave them space. He had grown used to their presence, to the quiet companionship that had enriched his life for a few nights. But now it was time to let go. Without further hesitation, the larger wolf moved first toward the forest, its gaze briefly meeting Warren's as if to say goodbye. Then the newly arrived wolf followed, and finally, with one last look back, the injured wolf, slowly but resolutely. Warren watched as their silhouettes disappeared among the trees. The silence of the wilderness returned. He took a deep breath and felt an unexpected warmth in his chest. Perhaps he had saved them, but in a way, they had also changed him. Back in his cabin, he glanced once more at the empty blanket where the injured wolf had lain. Then he stepped to the window and smiled. Some encounters were brief, but their traces remained forever. In the days that followed, Warren couldn't quite shake the thought that he might one day meet the wolves again. He spent more time outside, following the fading tracks in the snow, even though he knew they would soon disappear. He wondered if they had found their pack, if the injured wolf had recovered. But deep down, he knew that nature had its own way. One evening, as a new snowstorm approached, Warren sat once more by his fireplace, a cup of hot tea in his hands. The wind howled outside, almost like the distant howl of a wolf. He closed his eyes and remembered the time he had spent with the animals. The thought that they had survived, that they had found their place somewhere in the vastness of Alaska, comforted him. In the weeks that followed, the winter grew harsher. Warren went about his usual tasks, chopping wood, checking his supplies, and tending to his small home. But every now and then, he would glance toward the forest, searching for movement, for a sign that the wolves might return. Then on a particularly clear morning, he found something. Fresh tracks in the snow, not far from his cabin. They led into the forest and disappeared among the tall pines. He knelt down and examined them closely. The imprint of an injured leg was no longer visible. The wound must have healed. Warren smiled. They had made it, and knowing that was enough. But as he stood up, he noticed a second set of tracks beside the first. Larger, stronger. A second wolf had passed through. Perhaps it was the larger wolf, or maybe another pack member. Warren took a step back and let his gaze sweep across the expanse of the forest. For a moment, he thought he saw something between the trees. A movement, a shadow. Then it was gone, but the feeling remained. They weren't far away. With one last look at the tracks, Warren turned and headed back to his cabin. He knew this story wasn't truly over for him. Perhaps one day they would meet again, and until then, he would keep the memory of their encounter deep in his heart.